I'd like to go into the idea of non-self. And from the start, I would like to question that idea and try to explain why I think it's incorrect. When I think of non-self, really I think perhaps that means non-ego. I know in Buddhism it's a contentious issue whether the individual as a self actually enters nirvana or not. My view is that upon my entering into enlightenment, nirvana, I retain my sense of self. And adding to that, I would say that on whatever level of reality it's possible to be, in the psyche, in the spiritual, in the physical, and other places, as it were, beyond that, I think that self is the axis of one's sense of reality. So the self is present in a dream, the self is present in astral travel, the self is present wherever you go in the world, wherever you go in the universe. And I don't see how it's possible to enter into nirvana, as it were, emptiness, shunyata, without a sense of self. So as I'm talking to you, I feel absolutely a sense of self. And that self is in the body, in the psyche, and in the spirit. When the psychology of the unconscious was developing in the late 19th century, and it became focused in the neurologist Sigmund Freud, a materialist, influenced by evolution, and he more or less really impressed the idea of the ego upon modern consciousness, so that his technique of psychoanalysis more or less permeates Western culture. It's in literature, it's in art, it's in almost every field of culture. And so for him, the self is the ego. And ego is a construct of consciousness. The ego complex is part of the apparatus, you might say, of consciousness, which I would really translate as the central identity that is used throughout one's life at various phases. So in a sense, in ordinary consciousness, there is more or less a constant focus on the ego as the defining and controlling element in making decisions. So you wake up in the morning and you do this, you do that. You're a mother, father, you're a policeman or a waitress, or you're a priest, or you're an artist, you're a politician, or you're a mystic. Those identities at any given time can be ego-driven. Because whatever you do in consciousness, you're in control of what you're actually doing. And so the whole hierarchy of the world is ego-based, in the whole of society is a kind of control mechanism which is related to survival. So it's very territorial. So if you equate society, the world and its hierarchy with consciousness itself, then there's always someone at the top of the apex of the pyramid, as it were. So whatever institution you go into, there'll be somebody in control, whether it's a spiritual teacher or a particular scientist or a particular politician. And that's the world we live in. So in a sense, most people automatically, you might say, go along with the idea that self is ego. And then into the 20th century, you get around the time of, say, 1910, then Jung had met Freud, and Jung disagreed with Freud's idea of the sexual theory as being the kind of root of what motivates consciousness and ego, the kind of instinctual level and the subconscious. And Jung said that, yes, the ego more or less controls consciousness and filters out things from the unconscious, from dreams and such. And but at the deeper level of the unconscious, we're talking about the self. So he sees the self as kind of bridging the conscious and the unconscious, and self is actually, in his terms, actually brought into being, almost made out of the stuff of the psyche, the symbolic nature of the psyche. So you might say the self-complex, just as the ego complex is made out of the stuff of consciousness, culture, so the self is made out of the mythic symbolic type. Jung doesn't refer to a spiritual dimension. He only stays within the concept of consciousness, with its conscious, subconscious, unconscious. And the unconscious itself, the archetypal level, is out of bounds. Yet the self, in his terminology, is influenced by the archetypal realms synchronistically through revelation, which reveals the nature of symbols and myth, which is, you might say, very aboriginal, very religious and mystical, and works in the world, you might say, quite differently than the ego. It doesn't work from a controlling position, but more creative, inspired and intuitive. And Jung, when he was a child and right through his life, he always had a sense of both ego and self. And he felt that he was more of the self than the ego as a very small child. And he believed that he was possessed by the demon of the Godhead, so that his whole life was seen as acting out the will of God, the destiny prescribed by God. His father was a minister in the Christian church, and Jung remained religious and very attached to Gnostic Christianity. But he didn't talk about the self in respect to the spiritual. He said that the human being remains within the psyche, and when you die you just carry on the drama of integration and individuation in the psyche. So he would go into a vision and meet his parents and meet his wife that were deceased, and he found that they were doing work very similar to what they were doing when they were alive. So he spent the day with his wife in the south of France, where she was completing her work on the Holy Grail. So there's definitely a sense that Jung saw an extension of life beyond death, but never touched the idea of the spiritual, of especially the Eastern idea of transcendence, going beyond the physical and the psychic. So Jung's idea of the self would be that there's a kind of immortality about the self. There's something very ancient, and that he doesn't say yes or no about reincarnation, but he does consider it possible, and so he would see the self as enduring through the various reincarnations, rather than the ego. The ego is just, you might say, created in consciousness when the child develops. So you could say that each life that's born, each recurring reincarnation, the ego would just be simply constructed out of the culture and society you live in, whereas the self, the individuality, would endure. And he said, in order to realize the full nature of the self, you have to go through the individuation process. So if you take his idea of the self and individuation, then you might say it's a process of moving from, say, when you're a child, from the kind of ignorance of self-knowledge to gaining self-knowledge through your life, through understanding yourself, and then self-realization at the end of it. But he doesn't actually talk about that final conclusion of self-realization, whereas in Eastern texts it's all about that. It's all about the realization of self as Buddha. My own view is that each person, however they're conditioned by society from childhood, my feeling is, from my own sense of self and my own sense of my family and the people around me, and I've never found any reason to doubt this, that I think people do have a real sense of their self. Whatever the persona, whatever the acting out of the identity and ego in the world, as the mother, etc. I think when people are not playing a role, when the children go to bed, as it were, and you're just sitting, maybe having a drink of wine or whatever you do, and you're just reflecting on, you might be reflecting on your own childhood, you might be reflecting on your grandparents, on the history and of you know, your society. You might be thinking about science, you could be thinking about anything, but that time when you're on your own, I think people go back to their sense of self, and they're working out what I would call a life review. That at any moment during your life, you could say, from the time you might be a teenager, the self-reflection on your consciousness, you might say, on what you know, the knowledge of your past, or even the knowledge of the past of the species or cultural history. I think that life review, that self-reflection, that self-knowledge, in that sense, is actually going on all of the time within you, and at certain moments, for periods of time, you just go back to that place naturally. So people keep a journal, people keep a diary, and certainly I did from the time I was 35, much later than other people maybe, but that's when I consciously began to track my life story. So I'm saying self, in essence, is working on themselves, as it were, is working out something about themselves in this world, if you look at it as a kind of karmic study, as it were. So even though you haven't heard of karma, you haven't heard of life review, you haven't heard of self-knowledge, it really doesn't matter. But I think that process is going on all of the time, in your dreams, in your psyche, in the way the world constructs itself around you, what Jung calls the way the world constellates itself around you, in terms of the collective unconscious or archetype that then projects and reveals to you certain meanings, certain synchronicities, certain visions, certain dreams. And again, even if you know nothing about mythology and symbols, you're processing that. Your conscious is processing that. It's like a computer that is never switched off. I mean, the brain psyche is working all the time. So the idea of body and psyche, you could say, it on one level never goes to sleep, as it were. So if you think of somebody at the end of their life, say you're going to die in 6 months, and you're just like being quiet around the house and going into the garden and reading a book or whatever you're doing, and your consciousness is occupied or preoccupied with your life, with your past, and as you try to make sense, as it were, without knowing that you're doing it necessarily, but as you're beginning to make sense of it, you know, why did I do this, or why did I choose to do this, why did I end up here, or, you know, what were my grandparents like, or what did that mean, what did that poem mean, what kind of music, you know, so forth and so on. And that kind of self-life review, you might call it. And what I think's happening is you're distilling the essence of that story. Just like when you listen to music, you're really like a kind of hummingbird going to the flower and sucking out the honey, the essence. And that essence is the essence of your self. But the self is the self. So there's nothing to say about the self because that's pure mystery. It just simply is the self. Just like you say a tree is a tree. So I think self is self. And the person you've been, the actor, the persona, the work you've done, the person in society you are to other people and you are to yourself, that essential nature of your personhood, your personality, is distilled as an essence, and that's what you take with you when you die, and that's what you take with you into the next life, as it were, if that's the case, or the next incarnation. Another point about the self is that we know in this physical universe, the only thing that you might say is stable is energy itself. You could say the only thing in this material universe that's actually, you might say, constant or stable is energy. And if you look at the psyche, the dreams, the imagination, the thought forms, the whole process of the psyche, you could say, is transformative, changeable as well. And the only I would say, objective fact about the psyche and about the physical is the self. So, to me, self is spiritual. Self is rooted in the spiritual level, so that you have your sense of self in the body, sense of self in the psyche, and the sense of self in the spiritual. But it's really the sense of self in the spiritual that is actually present in all three levels. So when your body dies, when the universe dies, the self remains. When the psyche ends, so to speak, when the dream ends, when the astral ends, all of that, the self remains. So you could say the self is eternal. And I know that in the Upanishads and Vedanta Upanishads and the Tibetan Buddhism, definitely the self is synonymous with the Buddha and with the diamond body and the body of wisdom in the spiritual dimension. So I always use the Tibetan model. I think it's the best model for what we're talking about. Now, if I'm in a room with somebody, say my friend comes to visit me, and he comes in, and we get along, we're very friendly, and been the case for over 30 years. He's a Jungian scholar. So we get right down to talking about things in the world, in mythological, mystical, spiritual things. And I would say that it would never even enter my mind to think that my friend isn't exactly the same as me, in essence, that I'm relating to his self. We're chatting about what's in our consciousness, we're chatting about what we're identified with. He's a professor and I'm a writer or whatever. And yes, he's got a family and we knew each other in Oxford, etc., etc. You can say anything you like from your consciousness, but that has nothing to do with yourself. So there's absolutely would never come into my mind that I would see him other than a self. And that's true for everybody else I've ever met in my life. I've never ever thought otherwise. So all the reading I've done has not affected that absolutely in any way. So when we sit down and talk, the conversation is that we're inquiring into what we know, we're inquiring into what we experience. We look at what we know, we interpret it, we share our ideas and feelings, everything. And when he leaves, he leaves. He goes away, and that book closes. Just next day I forget all about it. I very seldom retain any memory of anything because I don't need to do that. I just share what I share with him in the moment, very spontaneously, and I just forget about it. I have no idea what we talked about. And I don't want to know, don't want to remember. Because I find that when I read a book or I have a talk, I get it right away. I mean, I go right to the essence and extract what I want to know, as it were, and I very seldom ever reflect back on what I've experienced the day before. Unless I'm keeping a diary or something and I might look back, or if I study some ancient Egyptian or Tibetan text or something, of course I look back, but so really self is, as they say about nirvana, self is nothing, in the sense that everything else is something. Everything else in reality is something. Self in essence is no thing. It's not a thing. See, self is not the ego, it's not an identity like a tree or a body or a dream. It's not an identity. So that's the difficulty. You see, that everything the human beings ever experienced is something, because that's what an experience is. There is no experience of the self. The spiritual dimension isn't an experience. You don't experience it. You are that. The self, spirit, the one mind, enlightenment, freedom, nirvana. They're all synonymous. And that's the mystery. When you come down to the next level, then there are the attributes of the Buddha, and you have ideas of enlightened insight, Bodic insight, intuitive wisdom, love, beauty, truth, justice, all the values you find in religion and spirituality, they're all there. And the reason why, in one sense, they're not seemingly not functioning in the world, because if they were functioning in the world would be in harmony. I mean, society, psychosocially, would be in harmony. Consciousness would just be in a sense, quite insignificant, whereas all we know is consciousness in the world we live in. But in an actual fact, when you're acting spiritually, it's insignificant. What I mean is, if you're walking around Oxford, for example, you walk around the parks and the river, and you walk past a bookshop, you don't have to go in the bookshop, you don't have to feel, oh, I need a book in order to live. And that's how I feel about consciousness. I don't need consciousness to live anymore. In fact, from the time of my awakening at 23, I mean, although I've spent a lot of time reading books, I've never been identified with that, because that's my karma, that's my work, that's the destiny in my life, is to do certain work. I've got to do certain work, culturally speaking. But I'm not doing it through identification or attachment to the idea of knowledge, or the idea of education, or even the idea of, say, being a spiritual teacher. I mean, I'm doing it because I'm ordered to do it from a spiritual perspective, from the perspective of karma. I know I have to do that. I'm meant to do that. I'm meant to be here where I am now, where I've completed the work. I've never been confused about that. I've never been confused about being moved around from place to place and leaving my past behind over and over again, the people, the place, just moving on. So that you might say, the level of the attributes of the Buddha, or the Buddhas of meditation, means that the self in meditation, or the self in nirvana, in the emptiness of meditation, you might say, when meditation isn't a process of meditator in meditation. There's no meditator, you are that meditation. The one, the emptiness, is that meditation. And you could say the silence is the meditation, or the openness, or the freedom is the meditation. So the movement, momentum of meditation is freedom itself. But it's not freedom from the psyche, or freedom from the ego, or freedom from the body. It's pure freedom. If you see a bird flying about the air, I mean, it's pure freedom. Or the river flowing by. So, in the sense of, when you're in the meditation of the one, then by extension, the meditation then, you might say, produces the qualities of love and truth, for example. And so that's what you're emanating to the world around you. So you might say the numinosity and aura of the self, the atmosphere of the self, is that. Like a garment, like an invisible garment. So my grandmother was known to have an aura of grace, which I've never heard anyone define that way in my life. So it must have meant something, because that was definitely something that was said. So she was quite a special person in the sense that, you know, grace is a very rarefied, and she was very spiritual. Not religious, but spiritual. Or kindness, you know, I mean, kindness is quite rare. I mean, real kindness. So, as I say, these qualities in a lifetime are quite rare. They're not commonplace. Therefore, it must mean that people are functioning in their consciousness through egocentricity or self-interest, self-concern, and all of the things that occupy and preoccupy human beings. It's not a world of love, beauty, truth, and all of that. So that's why there's a struggle. I mean, nature's a struggle, and human life is a struggle, and then you have karma. The work, because the alchemists call it the great work. I mean, it's work. I mean, the whole of nature is work. You could say the whole of the universe is working through. So, you know, human beings work. You work to survive. You work to produce a result. You work to produce culture, to produce painting, produce children. I mean, it's all about karma. That is karma. The character of consciousness, the character of the human person, is karma. So karma is not simply a kind of moral issue. It is about integration and order and understanding, but it's not a kind of superficial moral thing about making judgments on other people, about their behaviour, which we do psychologically in society based on a kind of Freudian model or a behaviourist model, very superficial, very petty. So most of what goes on in politics, in law and order, is very petty. And the arguments and disagreements and comparisons in people are just absolutely petty. If there was a modicum of love, then all of that pettiness would just dissolve. So, you know, you could say it's worth working towards love, as it were. The awakening of love, as it were. So in a sense, you could say the Bodhisattva Maitreya, the incarnation of love, within the realm of the Buddhas of meditation, is really all of that is going on inside you. It's a model of your own reality, and you awaken those things yourself. That's the whole point. I mean, that is the responsibility of the self. Self-knowledge and the spiritual is the work of the self. But at the same time, there's the work on your karma, there's the work on your person, there's the work on what's going on in consciousness and culture. So there are almost like parallel aspects of work. So whether you like it or not, your consciousness is working through the cultural material, as it were, or the personality material, and then yourself is working through the spiritual destiny. So that you might say the ego, consciousness, karma is fate, which is necessity. Like, you know, you've got to get up in the morning, you've got to eat food, you've got to look after the world, and you've got to do the work. I mean, whether you like it or not. Whereas self, or self-knowledge, isn't instinct-driven. It's not driven by anything. It's not a choice whether you eat this food or that food, or whether you look after yourself or not, or do the right thing in society. It's really nothing to do with that. And it's not a decision. So you might say, as I said before, that self-knowledge and you might say the understanding of the spiritual is going on all of the time, but say those of us who work with the spiritual are in a state of freedom, because that's the nature of yourself. So you can only be free doing what you do. That's the beauty of it. I mean, even in creativity, which is like, in society, as a choice, in culture, I mean, creativity is probably the most spontaneous and you might say freeing process we can think of, being creative, inspired and such. But still, that is work. But meditation, freedom, the spiritual momentum, as it were, it is non-psychological, and you could say, in terms of how do you feel about it, how does it feel to be spiritual, how does it feel to be free, how does it feel to be in the world, emanating these qualities, gaining insight into reality, into the very nature of karma and psyche and whatever it is. What is it like? And I would find it very difficult to give a psychological state of mind, as it were. Are you happy? You're in ecstasy? You're in bliss, etc. I'd find it very difficult. When I had the awakening, and it began with a kind of void experience, quite dark experience, and then it led to the light, and I felt free. And I think to people around me, I could see that I was seen as being very kind of liberated and very happy. I do remember that like, say, being in the world and being with other people, it's so easy, it just flowed. It was like non-attachment and just doing my own thing and not being self-conscious. If you see a child running around and you think, well, can I define that? Can I say, what is that state or condition of that kind of freedom? And I don't think there is a proper word. And you don't really need to know that. You don't really need to know that. When I'm sitting here now looking extraordinary, seen through the window, the clouds and the blue and the grey, and very, very subtle colours, and the Virginia creeper all across the wall of a building, bright red, and the golden castle. I mean, and the seagulls, and it's very. It's like a painting that's alive, but much more than that, because of the enlightened perception, clear light of the one mind. The enlightened perception of that, I could never record or tell other people about it. And if I tried to describe, say, to a philosopher, as it were, exactly what the nature of that holistic perception is, that they wouldn't believe me. I know they wouldn't believe me, because they're coming from consciousness, and nothing in consciousness remotely relates to an objective perception like that. Nothing. So you have these certain poems, certain sacred texts that are very refined and very subtle. They try to express what it's like to be free, what it's like to have holistic perception, etc. But I remember a dream where I was looking at a painting, and I think it was a natural scene, and there was a waterfall, and suddenly the waterfall came alive in the painting. Well, that's what it's like. I mean, that actually would be what it's like. And it's like maybe you're looking at a photograph and you know nothing about cinema, and you're looking at a photograph. Suddenly, the whole photograph starts moving into a film. So that kind of movement, you might say, from the third dimension to the fourth dimension, if you look at it in that way, or when you have Satori, and suddenly you're enlightened, and you see things, the world changes in that moment, literally. Then the self, yourself, of course yourself never changes. Yourself is the only, that's why they call it the diamond body. The diamond is the hardest of the crystals. It's immutable. It's absolutely immutable. Therefore it's eternal, as it were. And so that kind of, the nature of the self, because it's no thing, you can't say it's a substance. The self is not psychological, it's not a thought, it's not a memory, it's not made of material energy or quantum, it's not made of psychic energy or pranic energy. Then what is it? And your sense of self, there is nothing to know. So those kind of philosophical questions have no meaning. There is absolutely no meaning in any form of analysis by thought, knowledge or memory. No meaning whatsoever. And it's a self-evident fact. And I would say, in the whole realm of reality, it's the only fact. We say there are scientific facts and so forth and so on, and I'd say there is only one fact, because all those facts of science and religion, as it were, or psyche, they're all transmutative. They're going to transform, they're going to be destroyed and recreated in a different form, but the self is as the diamond, the hardest of the crystals, is permanent. It's eternal. But again, take away those words, and when you take away any form of description of yourself as you are, then the beauty of that is that it's incomparable. It stands alone. It's indivisible. It's an individual, indivisible self. So wherever you go in reality, to another planet, to another universe, to other dimensions, it doesn't matter what lies this side or that side of nirvana, whatever. And with self-realization, with the awareness of yourself as one, means wherever you go, you'll be one. And you'll be in that oneness. And everything else changes except that. So when I hear non-self, I think, who thought that up? Ego, non-ego is very clear. I mean, the ego, non-ego, yeah. No, that's my special study, is the self. That is negating everything else but self. That is the Buddhist way. You negate everything but self. And the void, it is that negation. So when I had my awakening, I entered the void in '68 when I was in Poughkeepsie, New York. I entered the void in a much more radical way in the Himalayas in 1970. And I was at the point of completely losing my memory, identity, ego, totally annihilated. But I didn't go through with the process. I could have gone through with the process. And I'm always on that threshold anyway. My identity, in ordinary terms, is very fragile. And I remember when I was living in a small commune in Oxford, a few people, in 1976. I remember this guy had been to the university. He later would become a Buddhist in London. And I remember him saying about meditation and psychedelics and going into altered states. And I said, oh, I can do that anytime I want to, but I don't want to. I've never had an out of the body. I've never let go of my conscious mind, as it were, into an altered state. And he said, oh, I wish I could do that. I'd do anything to have that ability. But it meant nothing to me. And it goes back to the time I was 4 years old, I think, that I was in Oxford. I was lying in bed, and I don't know where the lights came from, but there were these flickering lights around on the wall, and I don't know, I must have been looking at them. It might have done something to my consciousness, I don't remember, but all I know is my body was beginning to expand into the room, and I got quite frightened. Not enough to call out to my parents, but I got a bit frightened. And in fact, I've never found fear a problem in itself. I haven't, I've never been terrified to the point I'd scream out to anybody or look for people's help. So even during the dark night of the soul and the void and everything, I didn't go to anybody for help. And so my body's expanding, I get a bit frightened, put my head under the pillow, and I see some kind of entities, apparitions walking about. Now that point, that threshold of letting go, what you might call letting go into the psyche or wherever it was going to go, that's always been, I've always been aware of that. I've always been aware of the fragility of my identification in consciousness. As a human being, you might say my identity as a human being on this planet, as it were, and the idea of letting go of that as you would at death. So the void and negation is symbolic of death, and when you go to sleep, for some reason we find it quite easy. We don't get frightened. We just go off to sleep. And that's quite an interesting mechanism. And then we go into the dream. So in a sense, we do go out of our body, as it were. But in the conscious sense of psychedelics or meditation and people and mediumship, people go off into their altered states. I've never done that. And I don't know what that signified at 4 years old. But I think that was an inbuilt mechanism to do with my karma, to do with my role in the world. And it's almost as if there's an inbuilt reason why I shouldn't do that. I don't know, I mean, I can't explain that, but I think it rings true. It's as if I know that I ought not to do that. So I've never meditated, and when I did take some drugs, I didn't become involved in that kind of altered state thing. I didn't do that, and I find that meditation and drugs, in the sense of cultivating levels of awareness or level altered states, I feel that I didn't want that to be part of my life. Again, I can't give a clear definition of that or clear explanation of that. But even sitting here now, I understand now pretty much why that wasn't for me. That would have been a distraction. That might have been, it might have interfered with the kind of research and insight and understanding I needed to develop. But I don't want to compare myself to people that do those things, just like I don't compare myself to other people in the ordinary sense and in the extraordinary sense. So I don't get that concerned about people's interests. I mean, if they're interested in meditation or UFOs or you know, the occult or religion, it doesn't really bother me. I mean, they're free, people are free to do what they do. I don't think you learn too much by making judgments and comparing what people do. So it's just an interesting feature of my life, really, that a few things that did happen in childhood did set the pace for the rest of my life. They did do that. So you could say, in a way, self is all you've really got. I mean, whether in good times or bad times, whether you're in danger, whether you're going to die, whether, you know, I mean, that will always be there. Nothing else will be there but that. And in that is, I don't want to use psychological terms like security but I will say freedom, because freedom is very neutral. And another term the Tibetans use for nirvana and the one mind is the all foundation. So in a sense, again, because it's no thing, it's not a psychic or physical foundation, but you could say it's the foundation of your being. Because the beingness of a tree, the beingness of the universe, the beingness of the psyche, the beingness of reality, and they actually do say also that nirvana is reality. So the one is reality, and so you could say that is the foundation of all reality, whatever that reality is. So if the self is that, then what does that say? You know, we seek security in having money, in having what we want, and having certainty in science, and building computers, and extending our life, and wanting immortality, etc., etc., in whatever way. And yet self is the essence of security, is the essence of permanency, is the essence of eternity. So it's very interesting that whatever the language is and whatever the culture is, whatever the definition is, if you remove the word self, then, and you remove the word mystery, so in other words, you close the book of knowledge, the book of wisdom, the book of life, the book of reality. Say you close the book of reality, then there is the one. There is nothing, there is freedom. And you think, come on, how, I mean, what are you saying? What are people saying when they say that? Because there's nothing to compare to the self, to no thing, to one.